this is the NuPhy Kick75, and if you haven't figured it out yet, its big party trick is its ability to convert from a low-profile keyboard to a high-profile one, or vice versa. Now, how that is done and more importantly why anyone would want to do that, we will get into later. Before that, let's cover some of the basics with a classic overview of the hardware and what this keyboard has to offer besides its convertible nature. So let's start, or should I say, kickstart. When I first received the Kick75, which is a 75% keyboard by the way, the missing 25 is referring to the lack of a numbers pad. Anyway, when I first got it, I was pleasantly surprised. It felt dense and solid out of the box, but it also felt familiar because this isn't the first time I'm handling a board from NuPhy. For a number of years, they've been making a name for themselves in the pre-built low-profile and to some degree high-profile sector. This time, NuPhy flipped its tried and true formula around, quite literally. Whereas in the past their boards most often had metal tops and transparent bottoms, it is now the other way around minus the metal. But don't let that all-plastic construction fool you, there's little to complain about when it comes to its build quality considering the $89 starting price. Despite not being the biggest rainbow enthusiast, I must also admit that I quite like the new transparent look. It lets you see enough details to make it susceptibly interesting while hiding the less flattering parts a completely transparent shell might reveal, such as human and other biological debris that is bound to collect itself into cracks over time. But it is clearly still a NuPhy product. The color scheme on the keycaps, albeit more vibrant than in the past, is a clear indicator of that. They are still dye sublimated though, meaning that letters are printed on and are for the most part very level with only the tiniest deviations from each other. Their own profile NSA, not to be confused with the third party who is always listening in, hi by the way, is as typist friendly as ever. Apart from the signature color scheme, there's not much reminding us of its maker, there's just a little hint of its transformability on the left side of the outer shell, as well as its given name. To the right is a very soft, glowing light strip, another signature element found on, I believe, all NuPhy boards, and one that I always liked and still do. It also still acts as a caps lock and pairing indicator and has a few RGB modes you can cycle through. The same goes for the overall RGB on the entire board, by the way. Right next to it there is a small magnetically attached badge labeling its form factor and hinting at the video game inspired design, which we'll see more of in a second. I do not know if NuPhy will introduce additional ones for customization, but it feels like they should. Continuing our surface inspection, we find a rotary knob, an element everyone seems to love or hate. This one has quite an interesting cross-shaped design to it and feels pretty good. Per default, it is configured to change the volume, while the click acts as a mute switch, but can be adjusted for anything else, either via QMK or NuPhy I/O, but more on that later as well. There's also an attachment that you can get to turn it into a more traditional cylindrical knob. I kinda prefer the cross-shaped one to be honest though. If you flip it halfway around, we can spot continued gaming inspirations, with each of its corners sporting an entirely cosmetic but still nice green bumper. Once flipped fully, we see the final call out to the world of pixels, with an entire middle section dedicated to a fictional level. I first thought this was made of metal, but later when I came to my senses was confirmed to be plastic, showing numerous characters on a Mario-inspired 8-bit stage. From an unlicensed Ken doing what he does best, to a Pokeball that nobody tell Nintendo lest we want to get the attention of their lawyers. There's also a character in the middle with a hammer that I do feel like I've seen before, but cannot recall. Apart from the visual novel, we find 4 sturdy rubber feet, 2 kickstands with equal secure footing, as well as a long silicone strip which kind of looks like the top of a video game cartridge from the olden days. I did ask NuPhy about this curious design choice, as it does seem a bit overkill to have such an element just to hide 2 screws. And indeed, it is meant as an accessory attachment where you can 3D print your own little gizmos. They also teased at least one accessory themselves, a stand/holder for your phone, kinda like those Logitech keyboards from a couple of years ago. I'm not quite sure what I would print out, and since I lack a 3D printer entirely, I didn't invest my 2 remaining brain cells on this riddle. The remaining elements are the 2 switches on the back for Mac and Windows, as well as off, wired and wireless. There's also a lost oddity present here, and that's the magnetic holder for the 2.4 GHz dongle. I say oddity because it has a silicone cover, which is really neat for when the dongle is in use, but when not, it actually doesn't fully fit the dongle. I do suppose its bulge makes it easier for you to grab onto, but I would have preferred a more flush design. But at least it seems to be secure enough, as I tried my hardest to force it out via sudden gravitational shifts, without any success. Alright, that should cover the general overview. Let's open this up and see how it's made, as well as how we may convert it into a high-profile keyboard. The opening of the Kick75 is pretty straightforward. There's luckily no screws hidden underneath any of the keycaps. Everything's on the back, where there are a total of 8 screws with 2 hidden underneath the silicone cartridge we just saw. Once removed, the separation of top and bottom is as easy as pulling them apart. There is no need for any tools to jam in between the ridges, which I really appreciate. You do have to be a bit careful about the little cable connected to the rotary encoder though, which is attached to the top shell. Once disconnected, we can take a look at the pretty solid feeling piece, where I once again applaud the use of metal inserts. This makes repeated opening and closing of the board longer lasting, as no plastic is being stripped away each time you do so. To the side we can also see the little magnet that's glued in, which is besides the battery the only part that is using sticky stuff to stick around. Switching our attention to the lower half, we see that some of the green little bumpers tried to escape during the separation process, so watch out for those. Luckily they have a pin on one side and are therefore easily returned to where they belong. Then we are greeted with the inner sandwich, which consists of the usual combination of a plate, multiple layers of foam, as well as the PCB, which is attached to the daughter board and the battery. Again, be very careful when disconnecting these, as the cables are very short and you don't want to damage anything during this process. But after the successful cutting of the umbilical cord, we are then presented with the bottom half, which contains a layer of something. I'm actually not quite sure what this is, but it kind of feels like memory foam. If you do need additional support for your neck, you can completely remove it though, which also highlights the glued-in battery and reveals the remaining bathtub. So far there weren't any surprises in here, but I wouldn't let the lack of jacks in the box give you a wrong impression. As unexciting as it may seem, everything is purposeful and shows a culmination of all of their previous learnings. The only special element in here is the gasket mounting system, which for a low-profile keyboard is quite uncommon, but then again, this is also a high-profile keyboard. Because of this, the Kick75 is thicker than its competition, but you also gain a bouncier feel, which is, again, something you usually don't see on a low-profile board. With all this talk about high and low, it's about time we pack our bags and get to the top. When I first saw the ads for the Kick75, I kept wondering how can it fit both low and high-profile switches and keycaps. Well, the answer is it doesn't, at least not without help. The reality is that only half of the Kick75 is universal, and the other half, that is the top, needs replacing with the help of a $19 conversion kit. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have any tricks up its sleeve, so let's go through an entire transformation process to see how they did it. If you start with the instruction manual from the conversion kit, it'll tell you to begin by removing all the keycaps and switches, but because I'm terribly lazy, I didn't do that. All we really want is the plate, so you can do something pitchfork-inducing and just gently rip the entire layer off in one go. After that you can punch out the switches along with the keycaps and we're done. This is also the moment where we get a better look at the multiple layers of foam, including a transparent plastic one, which I have now learned is meant as an alternative to the tape mod. Back when we were all young in the early 20s, creative minds in the custom keyboard world discovered that sticking masking tape onto PCBs altered the sound of keyboards. Alas, the tape mod was born and made the rounds, with some loving and some not so loving the results. But let's not reminisce about the glory days and continue with the transformation, because it's starting to get interesting. Low-profile switches most often come in one of two variations: chalk, which look like little Bomberman, and the ones from Gateron, which remind me of a previous air-filled lover of mine. But just like me and my former ventilated partner, they are not compatible with each other, and you either get a board with chalk switches and are thus restricted to those, or you get the latter and are restricted equally. They also both differ from full-sized MX switches, with the pins in a slightly different arrangement, while the Gateron low-profile switches also have a much bigger stump. Enter the third kind, which is NuPhy's nano switches, which first appeared on the NOS 75. They use the same big stump from Gateron's low-profile switches, but the pins and branches from a regular full-sized MX switch. They're also slightly taller, thus resulting in a longer traveling distance of 3.5mm as opposed to the regular low-profile switches that only travel around 3.2mm. Again, just like the board itself, slightly thicker than what is normally found on low-profile keyboards. Did I notice a difference during typing? No, but I could imagine that some folks out there might, so keep this in mind. However, this means, as you've probably already guessed, is that the PCB has regular MX-style sockets, but bigger holes. And it also means that the nano switches won't fit any other PCB than the one from the Kick75 and the NOS75 presumably, and that the Kick75 won't fit any other low-profile switches than the nanos. I'm slightly disappointed by this, simply because I have an assortment of low-profile switches, chalk and gatorons alike, and was hoping to try those out on this board. It's also a little dangerous because NuPhy sells plenty of very appealing low-profile switches on their site, which won't work with the Kick75. To be fair, they do list the compatibility under each switch, but I think if I was just browsing around on the site, I would have brain farted my way through the checkout with a bag of fancy sounding switches and a board that isn't compatible with them. So be careful, but let's continue because there's one last part to this puzzle, and it's the stabilizers. Just like with the switches, low and high profile keyboards use their own type of stabilizers. Makes sense, after all, if the switch is taller, so must the stabilizer be, right? Yes, and the way NuPhy worked around this is by designing stabilizers that do both. In the low profile mode, they are clipped into the PCB and look unassuming like your run-of-the-mill pre-built PCB mounted stabs. But converting to a high profile keyboard, you take them out and clip them into the plate instead, thus raising their respective heights just enough to accompany the taller switches. Pretty nice. I gotta be honest with you, even following the manual, it took me a while to figure this out, but once I did, there was a smirk on my face for how they solved this. It remained for quite a while. But it also means that we won't be able to fit any standard full-sized stabilizers. There aren't any holes for screw-ins, and other clip-ins won't fit either. For the low profile, I believe this is fine. There aren't that many third-party options out there anyway, but it's a bummer if you were hoping to use your own stabs on the high profile version. After this, there was little left, with just a top shell needing to be placed before calling it a day. It's slightly taller to accommodate the larger switches and keycaps, which I chose to be the highest ones I had, the SA Vile Bloom. I was finally presented with a new keyboard, or half of one. The Kick75 intrigued me from the get-go, but it also confused me and still does. As much as I like it, and I really do, I don't know why it has the party trick that it does. If the Kick75 was able to use regular low-profile switches, I could see the appeal for those who may have those switches and low-profile caps already, like myself. Having the option to change it with little effort and no additional cost sounds interesting. But the way they have done it is very restrictive, and because the switches use full-sized spacing, regardless of which profile you're on, you might also run into spacing issues with low-profile keycaps. The Kick75 does offer one Frankenstein combination that I did find very curious though. If you just swap out the top shell for the high-profile one but keep everything else low, you get a third look. But I must warn you, there is a reason why the Worklouder Nomad E had a front lip right where the spacebar is.
Fatality.
In case that did knock you out, the newly introduced combo wrist rest might be a comfortable place to recover. Now, I'm not a wrist rest type of person. I do something called hovering, which I'm not sure is an official term, but once again, lack of knowledge. But I tell you, this new combo wrist rest, it is soft and lush and cradles my feeble hands like the warm, subtle cushiness of an elephant's scrotum. The combo name probably stems from its ability to transform as well, as it can be separated to accompany both profile heights. I'm not the biggest fan of the little tag on the side though, and as soft and warm as it feels, it's not as refined as the board itself, but still, I never thought I'd enjoy one this much. However, I don't think all of this transformability and the elephant body parts should be the Kick75's lasting memory, because even without all the party tricks, it's a very competent board. Couple that with full QMK compatibility, if you choose that option, makes for a rather appealing peripheral. You heard that right, by the way. There are again two options, a QMK variation and one that works with NuPhy's own proprietary software called NuPhy IO that is $20 cheaper. I did ask them about the price difference, and they told me that QMK has certain hardware requirements that result in costlier circuitry, which unfortunately also draw more power, which is why this version has a slightly larger battery to counter that. For my own preferences, I would still prefer QMK, although I never tried NuPhy IO, so I can't really say for sure. But it will run you $109 and $119 for low and high profile variants respectively. But what do you think? Would you prefer QMK or NuPhy IO? And are you interested in the Kick75 solely because of its transformation skills? or are you just interested in the board in general? Let me know, because I'm very curious to know your thoughts on this. I'm also very thankful that you watched the video until here. I hope it was somewhat interesting and a little fun. Also, full disclosure, NuPhy did send me the Kick75 along with the wrist rest and conversion kit, but they had absolutely no input, nor did they see the video in advance. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and I hope to see you again in the next one. Bye!